I've reviewed a lot of Switch controllers. When it comes to some of the more interesting unlicensed ones, one of the ones I've really enjoyed are the larger size Joy-Cons from Binbok. But something I haven't checked out from them yet is their more traditional Pro-style controller. So they hit me up and offered to sponsor today's video so we could take a look at the Binbok Ultra. Which I think one of the easiest ways to sum this one up is that it is featureless, the controller. There are just so many different additional options and things that this thing can do. So we're gonna walk through what all of those features are, how it handles as a controller in the first place, and ultimately what are its strengths and weaknesses compared to other options out there. Now, one thing I do want to address real quick about this controller is that while I am primarily approaching it as a Switch controller for the sake of this review and my experiences with it, it is one of those third-party controllers where it actually does have a much longer list of compatibility and can be used in some other different ways. There's even a little switch at the bottom here to go between a couple different modes. You can do things like changing it to a wired connection or X input. So you're able to use this on more than just the Switch. You can use it with PC, Android, iOS, lots of other options, but I am primarily focusing on my experiences with it on the Nintendo Switch. Also worth noting that along with those various mode types, it does also support a couple different connection types, including a direct wired connection, a Bluetooth connection, or a dedicated 2.4 gigahertz connection using an included dongle, which was the primary method that I used with the Switch. Let's talk about this as a controller first and foremost before we get into some of the feature lists. As you can tell, style-wise, this very much mimics an Xbox One style controller, which is a pretty common design you see across a lot of different third-party options out there. It does sport a rubberized grip, which can add a little bit of extra comfort and works well if you have a habit of getting slightly sweatier hands while you play. So it's gonna make sure that you're not gonna have that kind of slip grip feeling. Obviously, it is using an offset stick design similar to Xbox style controllers. The sticks themselves look like they might have an anti-friction ring, but not really. It's really just this light up effect for the RGB stuff that it can do. But I will say the friction on these are relatively low. It's not gonna be that gliding feeling that an anti-friction ring would have, but it's also not a rough plastic feeling that would be annoying. Overall, when it comes to the grip and comfort of this controller, if you've watched my reviews before with stuff, you'll know that I definitely like that kind of Xbox style layout and the offset sticks, and so this offering that kind of design on top of having the rubberized grip definitely comes together for something that I find to be very comfortable. One of the things that's interesting about the direction this controller takes is that it is very heavily focused on clicky feedback, which is something that honestly I do actually really enjoy. The ABXYs all have a clicky register with a little bit of a travel distance. The D-pad also has a clicky register for each of the 8 directions, so if you spin around a bunch, you're going to hear those clicks go off, as well as the shoulder buttons and remappable buttons, which we'll talk about in a little bit, all having that same kind of mouse click style feedback. I know this style isn't for everyone, but personally, I actually am a really big fan of it, especially when I'm playing certain kinds of games. I particularly like it on the D-pad for situations when you want to do rolling inputs, because you know when you're registering each of the different directions that you're pressing, which helps prevent you from doing things like accidentally over-rolling a little bit. Now you'll notice compared to a Switch controller, we do have one more button than usual on the front face. The little Binbok symbol button right here is going to be used as your home button. You have your plus and minuses on these sides here. And then in the middle, you have one button that acts as the screen capture button and another button that controls the illumination effects of the controllers. This is a button that's used entirely for onboard style light controls, so you can swap between different light modes, whether you want to have a single static color or have it do a kind of rainbow effect where it's going to transition between different colors. All of that is handled just by either single pressing or double tapping this button in different ways to change between these different modes. You don't have to make use of any kind of additional app or program. One other thing before we get into the feature list, one other aspect of this controller's core design that I do appreciate and is something that I wish would happen more often with a lot of other first-party controllers, Xbox in particular, because they're already kind of in this direction. It has a battery door that does include a rechargeable battery right off the bat, so you're not required to use AA batteries if you don't want to, but what's neat about this is that if you don't want to use the rechargeable battery for whatever reason, if you need to quickly hot swap and you just want to chuck some batteries in it that are fully charged right away, you don't want to deal with plugging it in, you have that option. So just a really nice midpoint that I appreciate. I definitely prefer using rechargeable batteries over AA, but being able to do both is a win in my mind. Next up, let's talk feature list. Beginning with what things you can immediately compare to what are traditionally special features on Switch Pro controllers, where this marks pretty much the same main lineup that we see in a lot of different third-party controllers. It still has a gyroscope, so you can do motion controls in those games that support it, along with maybe some games that don't, thanks to an additional feature this has that we'll talk about. It does feature rumble, although not the same level of HD rumble that official first-party controllers offer, though you do have some onboard controls for customizing how the rumble feels if you prefer that, and this does not have an NFC reader, so you're not able to use Amiibo with it. Overall, pretty much the standard now we see across a lot of third-party controllers as far as which ones are kept in what form and what stuff is dropped. Now, as far as unique special features go, a lot of that has to do with this whole bunch of buttons on the back of the controller. You'll see that we have 3 additional buttons right here, along with 3 little toggle switches, each of which add additional features. As far as the buttons go, these are fairly standard. You have a vibration control button, so pressing that will adjust the intensity of the vibration in the controller. There is a turbo button, so you can activate rapid presses on a button of your choice for those games where it can be useful. And then there's a remap button that is used for setting up the 4 remappable buttons on this controller, 2 of which are located here inside of the handles, as well as 2 up above in between the triggers. I will say that for these ones, the placement is done so that your middle fingers are likely to be resting on them when you're playing, at least when you're using a more traditional style of grip on the controller. If you're used to doing something more like claw grip, where you're bringing all your fingers up to the shoulders, they are going to be sitting a little more left alone, and you can just reach over with your ring finger to click them if you want. Resistance is high enough that you're not going to be constantly accidentally clicking this, but because of their placement and prominence, I will say that there is a little bit of light risk that you might accidentally press these if you're prone to being not as careful with your fingers wrapped around the grip. The buttons on top, meanwhile, are placed in a way that you're not going to be resting your fingers on them regularly, but they're just within reach enough that it's pretty comfortable to swap between pressing one of the trigger buttons and then going over to it. Obviously, because of this placement, you're not going to be using these when you're actively using the triggers heavily in a game, but they do make for a handy additional pair of buttons for games that aren't quite as shoulder button heavy. Meanwhile, our 3 little toggle switches. The first one is a very interesting feature that I actually can't say I've seen before on a controller that I've at least personally reviewed and tested. This is a button that basically forces a motion control option in games that don't traditionally offer it. Basically what it does is that when it's activated, the controller will read all of your tilts on the controller as being right stick presses. So if you're playing a first-person shooter game where you would like to have motion controls, but it's not actually innately supported, you can activate this switch in order to basically force a mode where it does that. It doesn't feel quite as natural. There's definitely a slightly more rigidity to the motion in comparison, but it actually works out a lot better than I thought it would. Now the thing is, with Nintendo Switch, a lot of their first-person games do support motion controls right off the bat, but if you happen to be playing one of those few games where that's not an option, or you're using this for another platform like PC, this can be a pretty handy function to add that support. I will say, just make sure that if you grab this controller to double check whether or not that feature is on, because I didn't realize that was one of the features and that switch was on, and I was very confused why a lot of my video game menus were getting mad at me whenever I lightly moved the controller a certain way. As for these 2 additional toggle buttons, these are both used for FPS focused features as well, specifically for turning off dead zones. If you're not familiar with the concept, traditionally both sticks and triggers in a controller have these little initial dead zones where they're not going to read very fine inputs on things. That way you're not accidentally pushing the stick and having it read when you don't want it to. Same goes for triggers if you don't want them to be overly sensitive where the lightest bit of pressure causes them to go off. But in situations where you do want that to happen for the most responsive controls possible, you can toggle these switches to turn those dead zones off. This makes it so that if you do any degree of pressure or movement on the stick, it's going to read that right away. And same goes for the triggers. If you want a game to just register a shot as soon as you're applying any pressure to it, that mode is going to activate that. And then one other quick feature I forgot to mention, because I know this is a make or break for some people when it comes to Nintendo Switch, this is able to wake the system up from sleep. You don't have to turn your Switch on first to then be able to use the controller. As long as it has been previously paired to the Switch, you're going to be able to turn the system on by pressing that Binbok home button, and that will wake it up. Ultimately, this Ultra Pro controller reminds me a lot of Binbok's larger size Joy-Cons in that when it comes to feature list and compatibility and a lot of support, there is a lot going on with this controller that is a positive. While when it comes to certain other aspects like build quality, it does feel a bit more like a cheaper third-party option. Now, the upside of this is that by being an unlicensed third-party option, while it does feel cheaper in some respects, you're also getting it at a lower price point while offering a lot of these additional special features, giving a lot of bang for your buck. I would say that if your goal is a controller that absolutely nails the fundamentals and build quality, this isn't necessarily going to be your first choice, but if you're interested in a lot of these additional special features, as well as the clicky register and everything, which was actually one of the biggest surprises for me with this, I love it on the ABXY and the D-pad, then this is definitely an option worth looking into. Not to mention the very wide compatibility that it has to offer across devices aside from just the Nintendo Switch. If you're interested in grabbing one of these, I do have a link posted down below in the description. I want to thank Binbok once again for sponsoring today's video to showcase this controller. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit that thumbs up button to let me know, as well as subscribe if you haven't yet. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on future videos, and I'll see you guys later.